This is Masters in Business with Barry Ritholtz on Bloomberg Radio.
This week on the podcast, I have a special guest. His name is Greg Zuckerman. He is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and an author of numerous books. The one we spend the better part of 2 hours discussing is The Man Who Solved the Market, how Jim Simons launched the quant revolution. If you are at all interested in so many things, Renaissance Technologies and Jim Simons, quantitative investing, hedge funds, how difficult it is to beat the market, and how astonishing the performance of Renaissance Technologies has been. Let me tease you a little bit. 30 years, 66% a year. That is just mind-blowing. Nobody in the universe comes close. There isn't anybody who does half of that. That's what makes this so just completely mind-boggling. They are absolutely a unique entity. You will find this to be an absolutely fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed the book. I plowed through it in a day and a half on the beach over the holiday weekend, and it's not out until November 5th. So by the time you're hearing this, it will be available for pre-order. All I can say is I enjoyed the book, and I had a fascinating conversation with Greg, and I'm sure you will enjoy it. So with no further ado, my conversation with Greg Zuckerman.
This is Masters in Business with Barry Ritholtz on Bloomberg Radio.
My extra special guest this week, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Greg Zuckerman, Wall Street Journal reporter and author, two-time winner of the Gerald Loeb Award for Outstanding Business Reporting. He is the author of The Frackers, the outrageous inside story of the new billionaire Wildcats, and The Greatest Trade Ever, how John Paulson defied Wall Street and made history. But his newest and most fascinating book is Jim Simons, The Man Who Solved the Markets and Launched a Quant Revolution. Greg Zuckerman, welcome to Bloomberg.
Great to be here.
I think I sort of retitled the book for you. So I'm fascinated by Jim Simons ever since I was a high school student applying to Stony Brook Math Department, where he turned out to be the chairman. That plus 60% annual returns for 30 years, those are just astonishing numbers. What was it that made you decide to write a book about the most reclusive hedge fund manager ever?
So I've always wanted to. He's sort of, if you're a financial journalist, and I focus on the buy side to a large extent, there's no one more impressive.
He's the white whale, isn't he?
He is the white whale, and yet he's also got this mystique about him, partly because they're such a secretive firm. Others have tried. That was part of the allure as well, that others had reached out to him. He didn't want to work with them. I myself had tried. He didn't want to cooperate. For whatever reason, that created and added a level of mystique and allure for me, so I took the challenge on.
So in pursuit of this, you spoke to over 40 current and former Renaissance employees. What was that like?
Well, early on, it was quite difficult. No one wanted to talk to me.
And why was that? I know there's a little bit of paperwork involved as to why some people were hesitant to speak with you.
Right. So Jim Simons and his colleagues at the firm have everyone sign 40-page non-disclosures, non-competes, and they're serious about them. I was warned early on, don't waste your time, Greg, both by people internally, people that used to work there. Simons himself said he wouldn't talk to me. It got worse than that. Simons started telling people I wanted to talk to not to talk to me, not to cooperate with me.
In other words, you would set up a conversation with someone and he would get wind of it and quash it.
Yeah, I had meetings set up with senior people in the industry, in the quant world, billionaires who you wouldn't think would care what Jim Simons would think. These are rivals of Renaissance. Right. And yet, right before we were supposed to sit down, they said, sorry, I can't talk to you, Greg. Jim asked me not to.
Nobody talks about the family. You describe
it
very
much like the mafia, right? Yes, we're competing, but there are things you don't do. And one thing you don't do in the quant world is get Jim Simons upset. So here I was being told, don't waste your time. Simons isn't going to work with you. I'm not going to work with you because Jim asked me not to. I literally had my advance and not insignificant advance from my publisher on my desk in my basement in my home in suburban New Jersey, and I wouldn't cash it because I wanted the ability to hand it back.
Because you were concerned you wouldn't be able to get anything done without any cooperation.
Right. If you talk to my wife, she can give you all kinds of conversations where I was whining and complaining and just frustrated and concerned that I wouldn't be able to pull this thing off. And at one point, the accounting department from Penguin, they were like, what's the deal with that check?
Why hasn't this check cleared?
Something's wrong, because what author doesn't cash a check? You know, we don't do so well.
What was the turning point where you felt, oh, now I'm starting to at least get a little traction with these guys?
Right. So I went out to California and I spoke to some former colleagues of Simon's who worked with Jim back in the day, back in the 80s and 90s.
Early day.
Right. And their story was just too fascinating not to do the book, and too compelling. I mean, these are interesting characters. As a writer, you look for just colorful, intriguing individuals, characters that you could write about, and you couldn't do better than these people. They were temperamental, they were high-strung, they were fascinating, they were smart, they'd accomplished all kinds of things in academia, and then they took on this challenge of trying to conquer the markets. So, and there was all kinds of intrigue that I wasn't really aware of behind the scenes. Anger, fights, disputes, screaming matches, things that, you know, when you think of a quant and, you know, mathematicians, maybe just I didn't really think they
cool.
bled like you and I. Yes, exactly.
Right, sort of detached, deliberative, scientific.
Right. So when I learned about the early story of Renaissance, and it's quite fascinating, I said, you know what, how do I not write this book? It was a bit of a leap. So I had the early part, but then what do I do about the middle and the later parts where people, there weren't as many people who had retired, who were academics,
right,
who might speak to me. These are more recent types of individuals. Some still there. I had to somehow get them to talk.
So what was the turning point? When did you start to have these folks speak with you?
When I got a good sense for the story, I got some people who work there to open up to me. Mm-hmm. And why they spoke to me, as a writer, you're never 100% sure. I believe that good stories want to come out. And this is a great story. This is the greatest financial investor in modern history. Jim Simons, his firm is the most impressive money-making operation in Wall Street history. So some of them were proud, and some of them actually wanted to share and talk to the extent that they could. They kind of wouldn't tell me, usually.
No secret sauce came out.
Well, it leaked out, so here and there. So that's my job as a writer. You get a little snippet. They drop a little crumb here and there. It's my job to kind of put it together into something of a loaf, or at least a half a loaf for the readers. So they gave me enough to give me encouragement. Yes, they weren't laying out all the algorithms for me. Not that I would understand them anyway. When I finally and then I finally got Simons to speak.
So discuss that, because for the longest time he said, "No, I want nothing to do with this. I'm never going to speak to you." How did you finally get him to sit down with you, and how long did you talk to him for?
So we had and still have a complicated relationship. He didn't want the book to be written. He still, as of a few months ago, asked, do I really have to write this book? Part of it is the guy makes $1.5 billion hardly going into the office and doesn't want to rock the boat. These are hardworking individuals, scientists he's hired or helped hire or have joined subsequently, and he doesn't want to get them angry. He's generally a pretty good guy, and here they are working, slaving away, and if the guy making $1.5 billion is telling secrets, they wouldn't be thrilled with him. So he didn't really want this book being told, but at some point he got the message that I wasn't going away, and he realized I was doing serious research. So I was talking to academics he worked with back in the day, code breakers. He's got this really rich, fascinating life even before he got to Renaissance. If he had never started Renaissance, he never even invested, he'd still be ample opportunity to write a book. There'd be reason to write about him. So I think when he started hearing from these 70 and 80-year-old academics, from Princeton and other kinds of places he worked with back in the 70s and in the 60s even. He got the message I wasn't going away. And I think you realized, well, better to talk to Zuckerman than not share any perspective in a book about him and his firm.
The joke I used to hear from people who had reluctant interviewees in other books was, well, who do you want to shape the story? Do you want to shape the narrative, or do you want to let your competitors and enemies shape the narrative?
Right. And that's a lot of my approach in my day-to-day writing at the Wall Street Journal. I call it the haircut approach. I'm going to give you a haircut. You can sit still or you can move around, but I'm going to give you a haircut. And it's not to say that it's a threat in any way. It's being...
it's just honest.
Right. It's a little blunt, but yeah. And Simons realized that there's something to be said for working with me. But I do want to make it clear that he wouldn't share inside secret sauce, as you describe it. So I don't want to suggest that he kind of opened the kimono. That was still difficult to the end. So so we sat down together multiple times.
For how many hours did you talk to him?
We added it all up. It was over 10 hours.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
That's a lot of Jim Simons FaceTime.
It was a lot of time. And the topics ranged. They included his recent life, which is also quite interesting, what he's trying to do in autism research, science, education, subsidizing teachers around the city of New York City, politics a little bit too. He's a big funder of democratic causes and candidates. So the topics ranged. He was generous with his time and regarding some of those subjects, his early life and his mathematics. A guy like me needed help understanding, so I appreciate the help he gave me there. And in terms of the day-to-day...
Are you saying Jim Simons tutored you in mathematics?
To some extent, yeah. He was quite helpful because... I had a lot of people helping me.
But he is a professor at heart, and I could see him, even though he is objecting to your purpose, I could see him kind of saying, no, let me explain the math here and bring you along.
Right, and part of it is, and I've learned this, something about mathematicians, little mistakes really bother them, much more than they do me or people that come from a different perspective. So I think it would have just bothered him had there been significant errors in the book, be it in regard to his early life, other parts of his life. And I get that. I would send small sections. We don't send large sections, but small sections to various top mathematicians. And they would get angry. Greg, this is all wrong. How can you write this? It's overstated. It's wrong. You got to change everything. And, you're taken aback. Early on, I was taken aback. Eventually, I learned not to be. And then you drill into it. And I don't know, their 5% was wrong, but that 5% really bothers them. So I got that. So I think if you're Jim Simons, this guy's writing a 350-page book about you and your life. If there were glaring, dumb errors, it would have bothered him.
Really would have set him off. Let's talk a little bit about the book and what's revealed in it. I've kind of been a Jim Simons groupie for a few decades. I think I know about everything that was public about him and Renaissance Technologies and who worked there and their approaches, but I found the book filled with so many surprises and so many unknown things in the past. Tell us what you thought was the most surprising thing you learned, and how much of this is fresh, new information that was never publicly known before.
Sure. So I've read everything that's been written about Jim and his firm. I've watched every interview on YouTube. There are a few here and there. And I would say about 90% of what's in my book is fresh and new.
I think that's about right. I felt like almost everything, like every now and then I would recognize something. Oh, I kind of knew that. But every page, it was a new revelation that was something previously unknown to me.
And as a writer, that's sort of why I did it, to learn. I didn't know enough about this world and about Jim, and each of these characters is potentially a book in their own right. There were so many. I think that was one surprise. There were so many rich characters at the firm. It's not sort of Jim and, okay, you hear Bob Mercer and Peter Brown. Time after time, I ran into fascinating, accomplished, quirky, colorful characters. And the other surprise is how hard it is to be a quant. So you think of these guys are mathematicians, they're scientists. You would think that instinctively they would want to pursue a quantitative approach, the scientific method. That's where they come from. And yet, from the beginning, from Simons and his early colleagues, guys like Lenny Baum, Jim Axe, Ellen Burlekamp, others, you see that they're fighting their instinct. Their instinct is to kind of just trade like you and I do, just sort of look at the news and anticipate where the world is going and the markets are going. And they sometimes fall back into that pattern, even they.
That was shocking. The early parts of the book describe Jim Simons as the derogatory term I use. He's a macro tourist. He's like every day trader watching TV, looking for news, trading in and out of stuff, doing good some days, losing money the other days. But there's nothing special or unique about that. He was every newbie trader, wasn't he?
Listen, he had unique approaches, what he thought were unique approaches. I get into them. At one point, he consulted with this early economist named Alan Greenspan, and they had different ways they thought they had an edge. But no, they didn't have an edge. Not only that, but it tore him up inside. It literally physically made him ill that he'd come into the office just unsure of himself. Some days up, some days down. They made a lot of money at one point. Then they gave back a lot of money. There were fallings out with different types of people. But it's not just the early days. Even last year, end of last year, the market is imploding, as we recall. And
down 20% Q4 of 2018.
Exactly. And Jim Simons, and I write this story, I tell this anecdote in the book. He's on vacation on his huge ship somewhere, and he starts panicking about the market. And he calls his wealth manager, the guy's managing his money. I mean, Jim Simons is worth $23 billion, so he has quite the portfolio. And he's like, hey, maybe we should be buying some insurance here. That's like me panicking. The market's down. Hey, should I be selling?
Down 20%. Like that's a big deal. I guess when it's $23 billion, it is a big deal.
It is, but he's a guy who made his $23 billion on the scientific approach, on testing ideas, on having a systematic approach to investing, not on these narratives and nervousness and reacting, all these behavioral mistakes that we all make. He was about to make too. So even an 80-year-old, the genius, the guy who solved the market, as I call it, he is apt to trade like everybody else. And the point being, it's not easy being a quant. You have to fight your instincts to some extent, even when you're a scientist and a mathematician.
So let's talk about that a sec. In the early days, when Renaissance was starting to become who they eventually become, their big secret, they were really big data before big data was a thing. Before CRISP or Reuters or Dow Jones or Bloomberg made commercial database of market prices available, they were effectively assembling their own. That was fairly unique, wasn't it?
That's exactly right. And that was one of their early edges. And frankly, they were collecting data when no one cared about it. No one saw a need for it. This is pre-Bloomberg, pre-everything else. They were going down to the Fed, collecting obscure pieces of data, economic and other. They were going back in history. So it was several years later, but they were collecting stuff from like the late 1800s. And they didn't really have a purpose for a lot of that data at the time. They had this instinct that maybe it was because they were scientists, that the more data, the better. And any kind of data could be helpful, and maybe not right now, but at some point down the road. And yeah, that gave them a complete advantage because then they could test, they could create models, they could do scenarios that others couldn't. And the way I liken it is to a little bit like if you wanted to create a library, how long would it take you? Okay, like your public library, your local library, probably take you, I don't know, a few months to collect all the books. But what if you wanted to create the Library of Congress? It'd be pretty impossible. Some of that stuff you just can't get your hands on. And that's what Renaissance still has today, and it does help them.
So the cost of building that database, and they were fastidious about making sure the data was clean and up to date and accurate, had to be substantial. The typical hedge fund charges 2 and 20. 2% management fee, 20% of the profits. But Simons thought the cost of the database needs to be passed along to investors. So instead of charging 2 and 20, he charged, brace yourself, 5 and 44. Who the hell would pay that sort of fee?
when you're making a lot of money, an LP will pay that kind of fee, and they did.
Their returns, which for the first time ever have been released, because it's always been a rumor. You're Appendix 1 or Appendix B, I don't remember which. The end of the book, you note, since 1988, the medallion has averaged annual returns of 66%, but that's before those 5 and 36 or 5 and 44 fees. Afterwards, it's only 39.1% a year for 30 years. Those are just eye-popping, astonishing returns.
Right. As you suggest, you will pay for those kind of returns. You pay almost any fee. They kept raising the fees partly to discourage investors from sticking in the fund, and eventually they kicked out all the investors. And that's part of their secret, too, that they capped it. They capped the medallion.
Because they realized it couldn't return these sort of numbers beyond, what is it, $7 billion or $8 billion? $8
billion a year. So, you got to give Jim Simons all kinds of credit and his colleagues, and they are the greatest modern day investors in history. But you also want to note that they weren't able to grow it. They knew they couldn't grow it beyond what it is right now. We're talking about the Medallion Fund, $10 billion. So it's not like they kept growing it to $50, $100 billion. They knew they could not get those kinds of returns.
And they currently keep the Medallion Fund, or actually it's been that way for 15, 20 years. Is that about right? For just Simons and the employees of Renaissance.
Right, which is a wonderful way of keeping talent.
Recruiting and retention.
Yeah, you don't even have to pay people there. I mean, they do pay nicely, but just the ability to invest in Medallion retains top talent. It also makes them so wealthy, quite frankly, that a lot of these guys, when they leave, and the few women that are working there, when they leave, they're not going to another Wall Street firm. They've made so much money. Right. They're doing philanthropy. They're going back to academia, other interesting things. So it's a great way to retain talent, and it's also a great way to make sure people aren't going to quit and start rivals.
So let's talk a little bit about one of the most significant people in the book, other than Jim Simons, and that would be Bob Mercer. He, by the time he joins Renaissance, Simons has figured out how to trade bonds, how to trade currencies, how to trade commodities, but he hasn't cracked equities. So Renaissance is a small, unimportant firm generating some nice returns, helping to make Simons conventionally rich, not a billionaire, but rich. But Mercer comes along. How important is he to the Renaissance story?
That's exactly right. So around 1994, Renaissance was an okay, middling kind of firm, respected by those who knew it. Most people had no clue who they were. They were doing nicely, as you suggest, in commodities and currencies, futures, but couldn't make it happen in equities. And for some of the people internally, that was fine. They were getting wealthy. Who cares?
But no scale, no influence, they don't leave a mark on Wall Street.
And that's what Simons wanted. He wanted to leave a mark on the world broadly and make a lot of money, use that money. And you couldn't do that unless they could crack equities. Because as we know, equities, you can manage much more money in the equity world and relative to the other types of worlds, fixed income and commodities, et cetera. So they were frustrated, and there were a bunch of turning points within the Renaissance story. They almost fell apart a number of times, more than I would have expected. That's another kind of surprise from my research. There were several times where they really, it was touch and go, whether they would keep going or not. So in 1994, there were people within the firm that said, give it up, Jim. Stop trying to figure out equities. And they almost gave it up. And then this guy, as you suggest, Bob Mercer, came along, and Peter Brown, two speech recognition experts from IBM. And they built an improved equities trading system, much improved. The engineering, the technologies was much better. They combined all kinds of different signals and factors into one system, which is one of their great advantages too, as opposed to different models. A lot of different quant firms have multiple different models. They have one system, and it's hard to pull that off. And that's what it took somebody like Bob Mercer to figure that out.
So one of the things we haven't talked about, it would be important to bring this up. Simons isn't recruiting people from Wall Street. He's not raiding Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs. He's raiding the IBM Watson team. He's raiding academic math and computer science and physics department. He's taking former NSA code breakers and hiring them. This is not the usual team of Wall Street whiz kids. these are really brilliant scientists, academicians, and others, but no one is coming out of Lower Manhattan. They're really a different cut, aren't they?
Barry, that speaks to the paradox of the whole Jim Simons and Renaissance story. The very people who figured out the market, who conquered the market, are pretty much the last people you would have expected, because they were people that didn't know anything about the market. Didn't know anything about investing. Not only that, some of them aren't even capitalists internally when you talk to them.
So let's stick with that issue.
Sure.
We'll come back to the academic nature. I'm kind of fascinated by Bob Mercer. The juxtaposition with him is, here's a guy who, by all measures, brilliant, rational, completely mellow and even-tempered, just a data-driven mathematician professionally. But then I guess that's his Dr. Jekyll. But the Mr. Hyde is his personality when it comes to his personal politics is the polar opposite. He's a wild-eyed conspiracy theorist. He trolls the other Renaissance technology employees. Simons is a big Democrat. A lot of the other academics at Renaissance are certainly left of center, if not Democrats or even further left. How does Bob Mercer play in that environment?
Yeah, so Bob Mercer is a scientist who demanded internally that everyone stick to the scientific method, and it's a data-driven firm. Everything has to be proved. There's no
all
instinct,
evidence-based.
There's no intuition, exactly. And yet, as you suggest, when it comes to his personal beliefs,
he believes every insane conspiracy theory out there. It's so shocking compared to who he is professionally. What I'm really trying to emphasize is how different personally his beliefs are. Yeah, I mean, everything he argues against doing professionally, he does personally.
Yes.
It seems just so odd.
He demands proof when it comes to work, and not so much outside of work. I mean, for a long time, he was treated as a curiosity within Renaissance. He would go into the lunchroom, get under people's skin by sharing some of these conspiracy theories about Hillary or somebody else. And people weren't sure internally whether he really believed in it or not. He was the boss. They didn't want to challenge him too much. So for a while, they didn't take him seriously. They didn't think they needed to. And then lo and behold, as the firm grew and he became a multi-billionaire, they realized that he was funding all kinds of causes that many people, if not most people at Renaissance, are really uncomfortable with, unhappy about, and they were stuck. They didn't know what to do. We're talking about everything from Brexit. He was helpful in terms of Brexit. Breitbart, he was funding Breitbart. And then he got behind the Trump campaign. He's the one who put Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon in the Trump campaign. And one can argue, and people have said, that there may not have been a Trump presidency were it not for this guy, Bob Mercer, which made everyone internally uncomfortable.
And let's set the stage for that. It's August of 2016. The Trump campaign is in the midst of imploding. There have been a series of scandals, back when scandals actually resonated. The whole Access Hollywood tape comes out. I mean, the Trump campaign was circling the drain before Robert Mercer stepped in with a few handpicked people and a little bit of cash.
Right. So what happened was Bob Mercer's daughter, Rebecca Mercer, who kind of runs the political side of things in the family, she ran up to Trump at an event, a campaign event, and said, "You better turn things around or else we're done." And Trump
had they been funding him financially?
Yeah. First, they were Cruz. They were backing Ted Cruz, and after a lunch between Ivanka and Rebecca Mercer, the Mercers switched gears, and also Cruz lost. He got out of the race. Then they switched gears. They became one of the top funders. I think they eventually became the top funder for Trump. So Rebecca Mercer runs up to Donald Trump at an event, says, "You're going to lose unless you drastically change things." And Trump kind of acknowledges, like, "Yeah, what do I do?" And Rebecca said, "You've got to work with this guy, Steve Bannon." So and Trump's like, "All right, I'll meet with him." So Steve Bannon goes out to the country club in New Jersey to talk to Trump, has to wait through. Trump goes through a couple hot dogs, ice cream sundae, plays golf, and Bannon's waiting, and finally he gets an audience with Trump, and he lays out strategically what he should be doing, and Trump listens to him, to his credit, and the rest is history. So if were it not for Rebecca Mercer and Bob Mercer, it's not clear Trump would have won.
I can't get a good read on Rebecca Mercer in the book. She's really very minor character relative to all these other scientists. Who is she and what was she doing before the election?
So Rebecca Mercer, like her father, is very conservative. Rebecca homeschools her children and believes in small government, low taxation, hates the Clintons, like Bob Mercer. But they also believe in data, and they also believe in the fact that they got really frustrated with mainstream Republicans, and they didn't think anybody was going to shake things up like they thought it should be shaken up. And frankly, as an outsider, as a writer, I look at these two people and I see too that people that never really contributed to broader society. It's not like they volunteered their time to do something, to run, to support, to fund broader society. Bob Mercer spent his whole life trying to make money. Or was first trying to do science and then trying to make money. There's nothing wrong with that. But then all of a sudden, he and his daughter become the ones who really have such a remarkable shift on society, on you and I. I find that a little distasteful, frankly.
Now, weren't they, though, on a bunch of philanthropic boards in Museum of Natural History in New York and elsewhere? They had to be throwing some money around.
Yes, that was.
Well, that was pre-election, though, wasn't it?
That's a good question. When did they go on the board? We can come back to that. That's a good question.
Because it was only after the election that the pressure started coming up to wait, he's a climate denialist and he's on the board of the Natural Museum of Natural History?
She is.
Right.
Yeah.
Is she on? Am I confusing who's on which board?
Rebecca was on the board of Natural board of
Museum of Natural History in New York, but she's also a climate denialist.
Yes. Bob Mercer's a climate denialist. He believes that nuclear war may not be as harmful as we all believe.
Once you get past the radioactive cloud, it's really not that bad.
I mean, that's the argument. There you go. Again, not based on science. There's like some stray. He picked up on some stray.
I'm being sarcastic, obviously.
He seized on a stray scientific paper that was since discredited.
Right.
Which is again goes back to the irony that a guy who demands science when it comes to his day-to-day work, when it comes to his personal outside interests, he's less demanding.
And then the other question that's so interesting is, how was Robert Mercer forced to step down as CEO at Renaissance Technologies, and what is his role currently?
So Bob Mercer was at Renaissance throughout the campaign, through the election, and many internally were unhappy about that, but not everyone. Others thought he was a good leader. He formed a really impressive partnership with a guy named Peter Brown. Peter Brown is tempestuous. He's always got great, crazy, interesting ideas. Some work, some don't. And Bob Mercer was the calm one. There was the yin and the yang, and they worked really well together. So internally, some people were like, what do we do here? Our CEO is still doing a great job. We're still making 60% a year in the market.
But for the destroying democracy thing, he's fantastic.
And broader society, potentially. And even Jim Simons was torn. So Jim Simons was one of the largest funders of Hillary Clinton. Right. And his top employee, Bob Mercer, was the top funder for Donald Trump. So he was in a bind. Jim Simons, he couldn't fire his employee for his political beliefs, and he also liked him. He likes him on an individual basis.
And to Simons' credit, he says in the book, who am I to tell him how to spend his own money? It's not my decision.
Exactly. And many were torn internally, but it got to the point where morale was being affected, and they were worried about their ability to recruit, and that's the lifeblood of that place.
What about outside investors? A lot of big institutions are not especially happy with Trump. How were they dealing with Bob Mercer as CEO of Renaissance?
So by then, they had started a few outside hedge funds for institutions and others. They still had the medallion, which is only for internal employees. But by the time of the election, they had outside investors, and many were unhappy. But that said, the returns were still really good. So it wasn't clear to me that how many were really going to pull out over Bob Mercer's politics. The bigger issue is that they were worried about their ability to keep attracting talent, and that's what they worry about. That is their biggest concern, because they're not competing necessarily with PDT and Two Sigma only. They're also competing with Google and Facebook. These are scientists who could go work somewhere else, and they were concerned about their ability to keep recruiting them. And at some point, Jim Simons said, Bob, we've got to talk. And I talk about that scene. I described that scene in the book. And it was difficult for both of them. Bob Mercer was effectively told to step down. And Jim Simons was telling his old friend who helped make him a multi-billionaire that he could no longer help run the firm.
The secret sauce, if anything, is that ability to attract incredible talent from all manner of academia and technology and science, isn't it?
They have a lot of sauces that are secret and impressive. They're collaborative. They're much more collaborative than most firms. They don't try to predict where the market is going. It's all relationships. It's groups of stocks versus groups of stocks, 4,000 or so long, 4,000 or so short. They have many, but among the most impressive things about that firm is they still can recruit almost anyone from any area, and they get superstars from academia and other places.
Quite fascinating. One of the things I found so fascinating from the book that I did not previously put together in my head, but should have, but the book made it clear, Jim Simons is really an outstanding builder of teams. He was deputy director at the subdivision of the National Security Agency Code Group. I'm drawing a blank on their name.
CRD it was called at the time.
CRD. Then at SUNY Stony Brook, he takes what was essentially a modest state school in New York, builds it into a powerhouse mathematics department, like a world-class math department filled with Nobel laureates and others. And then at Renaissance, he builds another spectacular team. Is it fair to describe him as an architect more than anything?
I think that's fair. So listen, Jim Simons has his faults. He's not a perfect individual, but he's quite impressive in his ability to both do the math and the science, and when he wants to or needs to, he can do the algorithms. But more importantly, his ability to manage talent. And someone internally said to me, Greg, it's not his genius, but it's his ability to manage genius.
Which is not easy to do.
It's really not easy. And you think about these really quirky personalities, which really jumps out at you, I think, when you read the book, how many unusual, odd, headstrong, stubborn top scientists they've hired. And, you know, they're pretty wealthy. They could leave and go somewhere else. And he was able to create this incentive for them to stay and work together, not just stay there, but they work together. And like you suggest, you can see that pattern early on in his career. He was great as a department chair at keeping people happy, all the different personalities, same kind of thing, where you can't really force someone who's a professor to do what you'd like them to do. You've got to create incentives. And that's exactly what he's done at Renaissance. And I think in some ways you can learn management skills from him as much as you can learn how to create algorithms.
So one of the interesting parts of the development of Renaissance was what took place in the mid-90s. So he's Mercer and Peter Brown are working on the equities portion, and they're not making a whole lot of progress. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and it's simply not delivering the sort of returns that everybody has hoped for. And so in 95, Simon says to Brown and Mercer, quote, "Get your system to work in the next 6 months or I'm pulling the plug," unquote. How close was the entire equities portion of Renaissance to never becoming what it became?
Oh, it was very close. And one has to also recall or remember or note that Jim Simons had remarkable patience. So he has this optimism that most people don't share. He encourages his people. People were giving up internally about trying to figure out equities. People were saying it's a waste of our resources, stop distracting us. And Simons kept encouraging his team. And yet, as you note, even he was at his wit's end and ready to move on, and gave his employees, his staff, Bob Mercer and Peter Brown, a matter of months to figure it out because they had tried and failed over and over again. And there was a quirk. There was
an error in the code.
There was an error in the code that a guy named David Magerman, who is a colorful individual.
You have to tell. So let's. I was fascinated by that part of the book. So everything seems to make sense abstractly, but it's losing money. It's not making money. And one day, one of the more junior guys decides to literally go through the algorithm, through the actual lines of code, line by line by line by line, and ultimately finds an error where one of the S&P prices is fixed Meaning it's supposed to update automatically, and it doesn't. It's an entry number instead of a variable that pulls the data inaccurately.
That's exactly right. So this guy, David Magerman, had just been hired a few years earlier from IBM. Early on, he had some accomplishments and got some respect internally, but then he blew it. He made a series of dumb errors, mistakes. Basically, he was doing things he shouldn't have been doing. At one point, he almost pulled the plug on the whole system. It was embarrassing. He was embarrassed. He was close to getting pushed out of there. And he's the one who said, you know what, maybe I can look at this system and find what the bug is. And as you suggest, it was static. It wasn't updating. The system wasn't updating, incorporating the newest S&P 500 prices, which sort of, is a surprise in itself. You think of these top giants in science. They shouldn't have made this kind of dumb mistake.
There's thousands of lines of code. Those mistakes happen, right?
Yeah, but you think of Renaissance and Medallion and Jim Simons, and who are they? They are like you and I, or at least not like
This
me.
was before they became Renaissance. This was really when they were also Rans.
Yes, but it also is a reminder that even the giants make dumb errors
fallible,
too,
sure.
Right? And yes, so Magerman picked up on the mistake. Internally, he finally got some respect because he brought it over to Bob Mercer, and it was Mercer's math. He kind of got it wrong, and he kind of, to his credit, Bob Mercer, there's some appealing aspects to his personality as well. He said he owned up to it and said, "Yeah, I screwed this up. Let's fix it," and they're off to the races.
Literally, as soon as that's fixed, the thing becomes a money printing machine.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, they went from managing, Medallion was about $800 million or so at the time, and equities was like $30-40 million to $10 billion of the greatest hedge fund in mankind modern financial history. So there was a small, tiny error that he picked up on, and the rest is history.
So other firms that are in the quant space, like D.E. Shaw, they had a big head start over Renaissance. What was it about Jim Simons that allowed him to catch up to people like David Shaw?
There are a lot of things they do better. Renaissance does a lot of things better than everybody else. There's a certain urgency within the firm that you feel when you're there and you talk to people that you don't really necessarily get elsewhere. There's a collaboration that you see internally, one model that other firms don't share. There's a sense of humility. They don't take too much risk. They pull back risk during crises when things are even internally when people are saying, hey, let's put on more risk. They generally speaking pull back. They use leverage. They use heavy leverage. People don't really focus on how much leverage, but they are a $10 billion fund that can get over $100 billion when they see the opportunities. I could go on and on. They really have the best trading ability to see what their impact on the overall market is.
Meaning they have the ability to execute trades without moving prices.
That, and they know when they'll move the prices and when they won't. So they can play with their signals and try to make them and try to make sure their activity isn't picked up on by rivals. They have some signals that they are internally are proud of and think people aren't aware of, and there's sophisticated stuff. These are mathematical relationships. I mean, it's one thing that I think everyone should realize, that it's not like they've got some secret sauce about when IBM goes up every day. These are mathematical relationships between groups of stocks. And the relationship to indexes, relationships to each other, relationships to factors. It's complex, complicated stuff. But they have certain unique insights that others don't. It's like seeing the world just a little bit with a better, with glasses when everybody else isn't wearing them. They can see things that others can't.
Quite interesting. There's a quote from one of the researchers. Am I pronouncing this right? Penovic?
Yep.
I love this quote. Quote, "Our entire premise was that human actors will react the way humans did in the past, and we have learned to take advantage of that." How much of that is reflected in their algorithms?
Yes, so almost all of what they do is based on predictive models that incorporate historic returns, historic moves in the market. And they could be recent returns. They could be from the late 1800s. They don't usually use those, but they're there if they want them to. So they've got the better data, and it's cleaner than other people. And they were cleaning it way before anybody else, and they cared about this stuff more. But right, the genius of Renaissance is that we as investors, our behavior is somewhat repetitive, and it rhymes. Now, it's not clear going forward whether that'll continue. So things have changed. We've got, as we all know, Passive investing is dominating the market. Active investors don't play the same role. Factor investing, etc. So will Medallion's models, will Renaissance's models continue to trounce the market? Even internally, they're not 100% sure.
Mm-hmm. And most of what they're doing, they're not high-frequency traders. They're not long-term investors, but they'll buy and sell almost a paired trade in groups of stocks and hold it for days or weeks. That's pretty typical.
That's a good way to look at it. Generally speaking, on average, it's about a 2-day holding period, but they'll get 2 weeks too. They'll do fast trading. They'll do what looks like high frequency, but really isn't, in that they're doing that usually to break up their trade. So they'll do a rapid fire within seconds.
But they're not in and out necessarily.
No, they're not flash boys. They're medium frequency is what people call it in the industry. Frankly, their technology is good, but it's not great. You would think they would have the best of everything, and they sort of poke fun at each other internally that they've got good technology, but it's not cutting edge necessarily. They're not co-locating and all that kind of stuff.
Well, they don't have to, though. They're not sniffing out other trades and front-running them. They're executing their own strategies.
That's exactly right. So people do get them confused with kind of the flash boys, but yeah, generally speaking, about 2 days or so is a holding period.
And we talked about in the early days, Jim Simons was sort of a macro tourist. He still occasionally overrides the system. Tell us about when that happens, and why does he think his flawed human instinctual judgment is better than the system?
It is unusual and a little bit surprising. They, generally speaking, never override their models, and they take pride in that.
But we can't say never, can we?
Generally speaking, exactly. In times of crisis, the firm will pull back when they're not sure, when they're worried. And that's part of that humility. So they don't have this arrogance that, our models will survive, the LTCM kind of thing.
They're not John Merriweather and that team at all.
Right. They get scared like you and I. And even though internally there are people that say, don't ever mess with the models. People like Simons, he doesn't run things day to day, but in terms of crisis I describe in the book, there's panic. There was panic there like any other kind of trading firm. And in those kind of times, he overruled his colleagues and he said, yes, we'll probably make money here if we stick with our models, but I'm worried about surviving. And if you think about it, they also borrow a lot of money. So they've got lenders, banks and others. And if those banks get nervous if they pull back on them, that'll affect things. So Simons, that's part of Simons' genius, that again, he can manage really well too and deal with investors and borrowers as well.
How much leverage do they use?
It depends. It ranges if they're excited about the market and opportunities, if they're not. But they could do 10 times or even more. It depends what the opportunities are.
Uh-huh. And 10 times sounds like a lot. Long-term capital management was 100x. The big Wall Street banks in the subprime era were 40x, so 10x almost sounds modest.
Also, you got to remember, they're long and short all the time. Everything is hedged. They're long, again, about 4,000 and short about 4,000 on average equities. So them leveraging up is not like you and I going long Microsoft and leveraging up. It's different.
It's pretty balanced, and the odds are against anything untoward happening there.
Yeah, and the thing to remember about Renaissance is they only get it right barely more than 50% of the time. And they're aware of that. So on the one hand, their Sharpe ratio is crazy great, which allows them to leverage up and borrow this money. And it's pretty impressive in its own right. But it also is a reminder, they realize they're not hitting home runs every single day. It's like a casino. They're making small amounts all the time.
Huh. Quite interesting. And it's sort of laughable today, but you listed in the book a number of fairly famous investors and hedge fund managers today who, in the early days of Renaissance, Jim Simons went saying, hey, I'm raising this fund and I'd like to have you be an investor. And they pretty much across the board said no, laughed him out of the office. Bruce Kovner, Paul Tudor Jones, who else famously said no to Simons?
Sure, Donald Sussman is the key one. Donald Sussman is one of the most respected investors on Wall Street. He backed D.E. Shaw. He's backed a lot of famous investors over the years, and he's a really impressive guy in his own right, got a great track record. And Simons came to him, hat in hand, in 1990 saying, I think I've got it. I think I've figured it out. I'd like some backing from you. And it wasn't that Sussman disagreed. It wasn't that he was necessarily skeptical of Jim Simons, but he had already invested in D.E. Shaw. Didn't want to invest in a competitor. And there wasn't much of a track record at that point. In 1988 is really when they decided to go all in on quantitative investing, using big data, using algorithms, as opposed to using some of the instinctive intuition type trading. And so there wasn't much of a track record in 1990 when Jim Simons went to speak to Donald Sussman. So you can't blame him too much. But yeah, there were a number of pretty well-respected investors I talk about in the book who had an opportunity to invest in Medallion and passed on it.
And then a few years later, or maybe it's 15 years later, Simons goes to the outside Medallion investors and says, hey, thanks for the capital, but here, we're going to give this back to you. We can't use it anymore. What was the thinking there? And B, what was the reaction of the investors? They must have been pretty, stunned.
So they, again, have these remarkable models that allow them to know how much they can make in certain size, how much they impact the market. They're pretty sophisticated. And they realize that at 10 billion or more, they're going to really not be able to have those kind of returns. Now, you and I would probably say, fine, instead of being up 66% a year, we'll be up 35% a year and we'll grow this AUM here and make the money. But no, they wanted this hedge fund to be just for them and to have these outstanding, remarkable returns. So they proceeded to kick their LPs out, kick their investors out, and they were not happy. They weren't thrilled. Some of them said, I stuck with you, Jim, through the difficult times, and here you are kicking me out. And he kicked out his friends too. He kicked everybody out.
Really?
And he basically was just
a little cold.
Jim Simons is a fascinating guy. He's a scientist. He cares about society. He's a huge philanthropist, does all kinds of really interesting things in education and science. He also really, really loves money. And he...
as a tool for what it can do.
Or just loves it. Let's not go overboard here.
For an academic, that it comes across that he is much more motivated by accumulating cash than the typical academic.
Oh my God, there's no comparison. Quite honestly, he always had one foot in the world of academia and one foot out. He was always doing businesses, and they were quite interesting. I read about him in the book. He pursued trading and pursued business, not full time, and it never really worked out completely, but he always had these outside interests. So yeah, he always really was focused on getting rich, and he wanted to change the world with that money, but he also just plain liked getting wealthy. So here they were staring at the possibility of seeing the returns slow down, and he said, I'd rather kick out my investors than risk the possibility of our returns of dropping.
And you described earlier lots of colorful characters in the book. Simons is really one of the most colorful characters of everybody. He's a chain-smoking 2 packs of Merits a day. There's a hilarious story about a group of institutional investors from a healthcare company that are there for some just kicking the tires to give Renaissance money. And there's also a birthday cake involved. Tell that story.
Sure. That's the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They're dedicated to public health. And they came by Renaissance's Long Island offices to talk about investing in REEF. That's one of their outside funds. This was early on when they were raising money for it. They were impressed. They were having a nice lunch. People around the table. Simons comes in to finish off the sale. Everyone's all excited. The salesmen at Renaissance can see their commissions. They can imagine how much they're going to be making from this big investment. And Simons, as you suggest, is chain smoking. He doesn't care. He's smoked with
Always has a cigarette in his hand.
Yeah, and he's also, 80, almost 82. So it hasn't really impacted his life. So he's in this meeting, and Simons looks around.
No ashtrays.
No ashtrays. He's looking for an ashtray, but he needs to ash somewhere. And he sees this big fancy cake that had been wheeled in to end the dinner, to the lunch, and everyone's going to have a piece of it. So he reaches over and he sticks his cigarette deep into that cake, and he's Jim Simons. He just gets up and waves goodbye, and that thing is sizzling as he exits the room, and everyone's just looking at each other, and the Renaissance salesmen are just dumbfounded,
aghast,
and apoplectic because they've lost their commission. They're sure this is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation dedicated to public health. So obviously, this guy just ashed in a sizzling vanilla cake right in front of them. They're not going to write a check, but they did nonetheless.
Hey, returns speak for themselves, right?
Exactly.
And In the book, I was shocked to read this. Someone says to Simons, "You're a scientist. Don't you know about the dangers of smoking?" What was his response?
He said to them, it's not clear if this was tongue-in-cheek. It probably wasn't, but he researched his genes. And according to his work, his research, he is one of these unique people that can actually withstand all the chain smoking that he inflicts on his body.
He claims his predisposition is to not get lung cancer genetically. He has the lucky, whatever it is, gene that means you can smoke without ill effects.
Yes, and is he fooling himself? A little bit like Bob Mercer with his pseudoscience outside of the office. And that's one thing that's kind of jumped out in the book, that these guys are like you and I in so many ways. They've got their foibles, and they get emotional in their life, and they get fights with their wives and screaming matches with their colleagues. And Jim Simons, yes, has convinced himself that he won't be impacted by smoking. And to his credit, it hasn't impacted him. So, once again, he may be right.
Huh. Greg, can you stick around a bit? I have a bunch more questions.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
We have been speaking with Greg Zuckerman, author of The Man Who Solved the Market, How Jim Simons Launched the Quant Revolution. If you enjoy this conversation, be sure and come back for our podcast extras, where we keep the tape rolling and continue discussing all things Renaissance Technologies related. You can find that at iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever your finer podcasts are sold. We love your comments, feedback, and suggestions. You can write to us at mibpodcast@bloomberg.net or give us a review over at Apple iTunes. Check out my weekly column on Bloomberg.com. Sign up for my daily reads at Ritholtz.com. Follow me on Twitter at Ritholtz. I'm Barry Ritholtz. You're listening to Masters in Business on Bloomberg Radio.
Hello, I'm Mark Elwood.
And I'm Nikki Eckstein. And what are we?
We're the Travel Geniuses.
Yes, we are.
Our podcast is all about great travel stories and even better travel tips. And we're back for a second season that will be in your podcast feeds on November 6th.
We've got an amazing roster of new guests, from a Broadway director to a podcast superstar.
So join me, Mark Elwood.
And me, Nikki Eckstein, for the new season of Travel Genius from Bloomberg, coming November 6th.
Welcome to the podcast. Greg, thank you so much for doing this. I have to tell you, I really, really enjoyed the book, not just because I'm fascinated by Renaissance, and I've had a handful of dealings with Jim Simons without his involvement. He and I have never met. But when I was a high school student trying to figure out where to go to school, I toured Stony Brook, and there goes the outgoing math department chairman. If you would have met him, you would never have given him a penny. The joke about all these people who passed on him, he had this scruffy beard and yellow fingers from nobody. I could see how people wouldn't have taken him seriously. Yeah. But I have to tell you, I and there's a funny story that I can't verify about the alumni department at Stony Brook. I can't even share publicly because I don't know if it's true. But if it is, it's pretty hilarious. I really enjoyed the book. I normally take a ton of notes, and the books are always marked up and underlined and with Post-its and, here's a question and here's a topic. There really is zero writing in the book because I read it like a thriller. It's a fascinating tale about really an amazing story with really interesting people. You did a really nice job on this.
Thank you.
What was the process like writing this? This had to be quite a monstrosity to put together.
It was hard. It's the hardest thing I ever did in my life.
Really?
Oh, by far.
I could totally see that.
The challenges were getting people to talk, and even when they started talking, understanding what they were telling me. And I'm not a math guy. I had to understand this is a different language, quant to some extent. And even at that point, trying to make it into a narrative. As you suggest, I want to try to appeal to everyone. The quantity type people, mathematicians, scientists, but also just the average nonfiction reader.
I think you accomplished that.
I did. There were a few times where I'm working all night in my basement, and I hear some sound upstairs, and I'm like, oh, my kids left the TV on again. And then I go up to turn it off, and there's no TV on, and then I realize those sounds are the birds getting up in the morning.
Oh, you've just been
I just
pounding
went
away
through
all
the night. And part of it is because I was fascinated by the story myself, and these characters are interesting and intriguing, and what they accomplished and the challenges they overcame and the drama behind the scenes that I wasn't aware of. So it was the hardest thing I ever did, but also it was rewarding and fascinating to me.
In the early phases of this, did you ever reach a point where you said, this is just going nowhere, I have to pull the plug on this?
Many times.
Came close.
Too many times, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't close to giving up, but I couldn't figure out how I was going to make it happen. And then I would have a breakthrough. Someone would be kind enough to share with me and talk to me. Maybe it would be on the record, maybe it wouldn't, but that would keep me going. That would give me encouragement and deal with all the people slamming the door on my face subsequently, because then there'd be somebody kind enough to share right after that.
When you spoke to people off the record, how do you use that if you're telling somebody, I'm not going to quote you, I'm not going to use this? How do you work that into the story? Does it just give you enough background, or what do you do with off-the-record conversations? And was Simons on or off the record with you?
Right, so I don't do off the record. Off the record, the way we define it at the Wall Street Journal, means you can't use that information, but I was upfront with all these people and saying, I'd like to use your information on background, meaning I can use it. Right, but I won't name you, I won't quote you, I won't cite you. And I said, I've been around a little bit, so I have a certain reputation, and I said, I'm not going to burn you. There's no incentive for me to burn you. I'm not going to name you. I'm not going to tell anybody at Renaissance that we're talking. So I got people sufficiently comfortable. And Jim Simons was pretty darn open and frank and transparent, I have to tell you, about what he wanted to speak about. Again, I want to make clear that he wasn't opening the kimono and telling me all his signals. I had to get that stuff on my own, and how he dealt with certain things and the setbacks and the narrative and the drama behind the scenes. But he was quite cooperative about other things, and I have to thank him for that.
So the early cancellations, the Cosa Nostra, Simons, don't say anything. After you speak with Simons, do you circle back with the early cancelers? And were they a little more open at that point?
No, they still wouldn't talk to me.
Really?
So I had to keep
even
pushing.
After Simon says, all right, I'll finally talk to you.
You know why, Barry? Because they were even concerned about the possibility that Jim might get angry with them. Oh, yeah, well, you say that Jim is talking to you, but how do I know that's true?
Ask Jim.
Yeah, but Jim's got too busy. This guy's he's got a lot going on. He's not going to call him up and say, can I talk to Greg? They already did. You told me I can't talk to Greg, but now can I talk to Greg? It wasn't worth their while. So I had to keep finding other people. And quite honestly, a lot of the people early on at the firm and in his life were old and elderly. And
you're 80-something. You're like, I'll say what I want to who I want. I don't really
they've
care.
accomplished a lot in their own right. I mean,
Right.
these are scientists that are big names, hollow names in some of these fields. It's hard to you have to focus on the fact that even setting aside when it came to Wall Street and investing, these people are really accomplished in their own right. So they're proud of what they've done, and some of these people don't mind talking.
Huh. That's really quite fascinating. I have a quibble with you.
Sure.
Is Jim Simons really the man who solved the markets, or is he the guy who just figured out here's how to apply mathematics as a way to extract profits from the markets? I didn't get the sense that he figured out the markets. The markets are just a means to an end for him.
Yeah, to the extent that he's recorded these remarkable returns.
Eye-popping returns.
To that extent, he solved the market. But right, there's no hidden understanding that jumps out at you that he knows that you and I don't know. He's as flummoxed by the day-to-day moves as anyone else. What he does, and his colleagues really do understand, is that what impacts prices is a lot more than you and I are aware of. Now, they've got whole levels of factors that aren't included in the AQRs and the stuff that you can buy off the shelf, et cetera. So they have a better understanding of the market, I would argue, than anyone else. But maybe it's a little overstated to say they completely solved it.
So the other thing that I thought was really intriguing in the book is, despite these guys making boat tons of money, just so much compared to what they would have made had they stayed at either IBM or academia, they're making 4 and 5 and 10x plus whatever the medallion fund is throwing off. Some of the squabbles about money, especially in the later history of the firm. So I described the firm as having 4 phases. The early macro tourism phase, Then there's a later phase where they figure out how to trade currencies, commodities, and futures. And then when Mercer and Brown crack the equity code is the third phase. And then in the fourth phase, they start to bring in a lot of Russian computer scientists and other academicians. This like fourth generation of the company really degenerates into this petty, jealous, backbiting envy, to the point where a bunch of them go to Simons and say, "You're making too much money. We demand some of it." How the hell does anyone get away with that?
Yeah, they were people telling Jim Simons he made too much money. There were people saying he should step down. There were people, it was something of a coup. They tried to.
How does he not just say, you're fired. Go back to making $90,000 as a teaching assistant?
Because I keep coming back to the point that Jim Simons loves money, and they were really valued employees. So they could have been jerks, but he gets past that, and he's a great manager. He wasn't insulted by that. Listen, if you're going to hire some of the top scientists in the world, you're going to get the personalities that come with that, and he embraced that. So he wasn't insulted. He doesn't take himself so seriously. He actually gave back some equity, and he said, maybe you guys are right, and I'm taking too much of a cut, and I give him credit for that. So
it was amazing.
Yeah.
In the book, I'm like, I just don't know, because normally employees like that are so cancerous. They could destroy a company with the sort of petty, envious jealousies that you describe in the book. I found that to be just completely shocking. And I guess he resolved it in a way that was pretty reasonable.
Yeah. He again has a great instinct when it comes to people. So he's not just like this quant focused on money and numbers and algorithms. He understands people and what drives them. And he thought he could work with some of the people leading the coup. Yes, they were headstrong and tempestuous and difficult, but they had potential as managers, and he was right. He actually he turned them into pretty good managers. So for whatever reason, he's got these talents on both sides of the equation.
So who's running Renaissance Technologies now? It's not Jim Simons as CEO, and it's not Robert Mercer.
Right.
Who's running the day-to-day?
It's Peter Brown, who's a former IBM scientist.
Used to work closely with Mercer.
Yep.
And was considered the more wild of the two.
Yes, and when he took over, when Bob Mercer stepped down, people internally were concerned because, as I said, Peter Brown is a little bit tempestuous and gets emotional sometimes. I describe a couple scenes in my book where he panicked and he got nervous and he got scared. This was years ago, and he learned from those lessons. And later on, when in market difficulties, he didn't react that same way. But people worried about Peter Brown taking over. And to his credit, he's aware of his flaws and his weaknesses. And he's been leaning, and we're talking the last couple years, he's been leaning on his colleagues, his senior colleagues, much more than anyone had expected. And it's worked out nicely.
I imagine Brown is Mercer without the politics. Or at least in actuality, because he's still working closely with Mercer.
Yeah, but very different personalities.
For sure.
Bob Mercer is this cool customer. You can't read him. Even his colleagues don't really understand. He's so unemotional. They don't understand where he stands on certain issues. You do not wonder when it comes to Peter Brown. So in some ways, they offset each other. They worked really, they melded, and they meshed really well together.
And what is Jim Simons doing today, day-to-day at Renaissance?
So he barely goes in the office, and yet he makes about $1.5 billion a year.
So why retire?
Pretty good gig, yeah. But really, but it's not to say he's not very hard at work. He runs a foundation, and it's really active, one of the biggest supporters of science in the country. They're very active when it comes to things like autism research, and they're at cutting edge. They back all kinds of cutting edge approaches. He supports, he funds, he subsidizes the salaries of high school math and science teachers in New York City, 10,000 of them, because he doesn't want so many leaving to go work for places like Renaissance.
What does that cost to subsidize? That's got to be giant.
Well, it depends how many each year, but it's huge amounts, millions of dollars. I mean, he's worth $23 billion. But to his credit, he's on the cutting edge of all kinds of different approaches when it comes to science, education,
They publish
politics.
Quanta, which is a basic fundamental science and mathematics magazine, which really, who else covers that sort of stuff?
And he's also trying to subsidize the work, and he is subsidizing the work of scientists trying to get at the beginning of life and how this world began, the first moments of our existence, of this universe existence. They're trying to build out in Chile all kinds
massive array,
exactly, right? of ability to see, go back in history and see through the massive telescopes to see what happened. So he's on the cutting edge of all kinds of different science, and he's just as focused on that as he was trying to crank out these 66% returns at the Medallion Fund.
The current theory of the Big Bang is under assault because some of it doesn't seem to work, and some of the work that Simons is doing is to try and figure out, if not the Big Bang, then how did the universe come into existence?
Yeah, Simons himself isn't a believer in the Big Bang, and yet he's funding efforts to test if it actually, there's some proof to it.
Because deep down inside, he's a scientist, and show me the data, show me the evidence, and if you can't disprove it, then that's the best we have to work with.
Right. The Renaissance story, the Jim Simons story, really is a story about the scientific method. If you think about society today and you think about the White House, it's all about narratives. And if you think about Wall Street too, Theranos and WeWork, and people get carried away with the narrative.
Stories,
and it leads to problems. It leads to real issues. Whereas there's something to be said. I've become a believer in the scientific method, where it's about data, it's about proof, and that is, to me, one of the lessons of the Renaissance Jim Simons story.
Quite fascinating. So we only have you for a finite amount of time. Let's jump to our favorite questions. We ask this of all of our guests, sort of our speed rounds. Tell us the first car you ever owned, year, make, and model.
Never owned a car, only leased. Grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, my dad taught at Brown University. Nothing really going on. The most exciting thing was we'd walk to campus, my high school friends and I, and try to hit on girls, and usually unsuccessfully. So that required legs and not automobiles. So yeah, didn't really have a car.
Wow. What's the most important thing people don't know about Greg Zuckerman?
I've got this separate life where I write books for young people with my two sons. So we wrote 2 books called Rising Above, where we've interviewed sports stars who overcame challenges in their youth: racism, sexual abuse, physical abuse, all kinds of different emotional and other types of challenges. And we asked them how they did it. And to us, it was really inspirational, and we share those stories in our books.
Tell us who your early mentors were in the field of journalism.
Yeah, so I never really had great mentors, quite frankly. I've had a series of bad bosses early in my life before I became.
Who's your current bad boss?
No, now my bosses are great. Early on, we're talking. So early on, I stumbled into this profession.
Oh, really? What were the original plans?
I was going to go work on Wall Street.
Uh-huh.
I was reading books like Adam Smith and Ray Dirks. Do you know this guy, Ray Dirks?
The name is vaguely familiar.
He had this famous case that went to Supreme Court. He was an insurance analyst who was shorting, and and it was a famous case that went to Supreme Court, and he won. And he left an impression on me with a book. I was buying Barron's at a young age. In camp, I was trading stocks. I was a guy who was going to go work on Wall Street. And I didn't really do any summer kind of jobs. I was working in camps and didn't really have any experience, didn't know anyone. My dad was an academic, and I graduated, and I did well. I went to Brandeis University, did well, and I couldn't even get an interview on Wall Street. It was 1989. It was after the market had crashed a couple years earlier, and I stumbled around. I started some businesses, and some worked, some didn't. And then I went in one day and interviewed to be a financial journalist. I'm like, wait, I love writing and I love Wall Street. They're going to pay me to write about Wall Street? How great is that?
So what writers influenced the way you think about writing, either articles or books?
So James Stewart, first and foremost. Everything he's
Long-standing
done.
Wall Street Journal reporter, right?
And then he's at the New York Times now, book author, Den of Thieves. He wrote a book called Follow the Story, which is about writing. Mm-hmm. And I've read and reread that book numerous times. So that guides me. There's an editor at the Journal named Mike Sicanalfi, who I've learned a lot from. He's an investigative editor. We had a Pulitzer package that we won this past year, and he was the editor of that group, and he has left a big influence on me.
Since you mentioned a couple of books, tell us about your favorite books. What do you enjoy to read, Wall Street related or not, when you're not researching your own books?
So Paul Auster, Philip Roth, fiction there.
Give us some titles. When you say Philip Roth,
Oh,
I
everything.
immediately think of Portnoy's Complaint, but what else do you read?
American Pastoral is great. There's really nothing much from him that I don't love and won't read. I'm reading Patti Smith right now.
Her autobiography
Kids,
just came out.
Yeah, right. I'm reading the earlier one, but she's brilliant in her own right. Catcher in the Rye at a young age left a huge influence in me in terms of being an outsider, and that's what, as a journalist, I see myself. My job is to kind of poke holes and look at the foibles and mistakes and accomplishments of others, people in the world of finance. That's sort of my position. In some ways, I saw myself in that character, the Holden Caulfield character, to some extent.
What was the first author you mentioned before Philip Roth?
Paul Auster. Paul Auster is a fiction writer who's brilliant in his own way. He gets into some
Give us a book title.
deep. Brooklyn Diary is a good one. He's so many. Brooklyn Diary is a good one.
All right, we'll go with that. Tell us about a time you failed and what you learned from the experience.
So many. So I got a tip that there was a guy who was running a fraud named Bernie Madoff. And
What
that
year was this?
was probably 2003.
All right, so there was already the Barron story, but nobody really picked up on it in a big way.
Exactly.
Right? When did that Barron's piece come out?
2002, I think, maybe,
Yeah.
2001. And
Good source for the tip?
It was a good source in the industry, but didn't have firsthand knowledge. So I started making some calls.
Right.
And it was early in the process, I got a call from Bernie Madoff's right-hand person. And they said, I hear you making calls on Bernie. Why don't you come in and meet with him? And I was torn. At that point, I hadn't done enough research. So I said, I want to meet Bernie, but let's do it in a week or two. Well, Greg, he travels a lot. There aren't going to be many opportunities. If I were you, I'd really take advantage. So I went in, met with Bernie.
Was he charming?
He was charming, but not convincing. I asked him a series of tough questions. I came out of it unconvinced that it was legit, but I thought he was front-running. I didn't think it was a complete fraud.
Not a Ponzi, but he was... Because they were a legitimate trading operation, weren't they?
Right, and I thought they were front-running that legitimate trading, and that's how you get the smooth returns.
Right.
And I wasn't the only one on Wall Street who had that thought, and that's no excuse. I should have pursued that story, and I blew it. I should have kept working on it.
So what was the lesson?
The lesson is to keep pushing, and if you've got an instinct and to keep pursue it. And listen, some of my best stories, quite frankly, are those that editors were lukewarm on, and then I kind of kept going at it.
Give us an example.
I wrote a front page story. It became a front page story about John Paulson and his tremendous trade, the subprime trade. And people internally were kind of like, well, he must have cheated. There's no way he could have done it in a legitimate way. I broke the story on the London Whale. And even internally, they're like, Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan, there's no way they could have embrace that kind of risk. I did a story about a family, about a brother of a woman in Cantor Fitzgerald who died on 9/11, and I wanted to tell the story of how his sister died on 9/11, and I started researching it, and people were like, you're never going to find out exactly how she died, and you know what, you work hard enough, and that's the lesson. Sometimes you can actually piece things together.
All right, so let's go back to our speed round. What do you do for fun when you're not researching and writing books? What do you do to kick back and relax?
I obsess over the New York Yankees with my son Eli and play a lot of sports. So I'm on a softball team. I'm on a basketball team.
Still playing basketball?
Yeah, not as well as I used to. I've learned to come off the bench. It's been humbling.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm a short
Like
Jewish guy.
40,
so it's not like
40 is where that all goes to hell.
Right, I'm at the point where you have a good run, good workout, and you're kind of happy about that. But I'm pretty competitive. So,
Yeah.
hey, listen, if I can contribute, then I'm proud at this point. I don't need to start and dominate like I was a quick, good pass-first point guard back in the day. And if I can come off the bench and help, that's fine today.
That's kind of fun. Let's talk about journalism a little bit. What are you most optimistic about today, and what are you most pessimistic about?
I'll start with most pessimistic.
That's an easy question, right?
I guess it's a difficult time in some ways for journalists. We're at a time where it's more, it's open season to some extent. You can criticize, you can be open in your criticism. So I wrote a story about Jeff Gundlach a couple of years ago.
Double Line, fastest growing mutual fund ever to $100 billion. the new Bond King.
Exactly.
So in case people don't know who he is.
And my story was sort of obvious. It was they had peaked in AUM. They lost some money. People were coming out. It wasn't like a flood of money. And the returns were good, but they're no longer great. And I wrote this story, and they came back hard at me, both privately and publicly. So he gets on this conference call and he starts insulting me. He calls he says Mother Zucker, he calls me publicly. And
Mother Zucker.
It was kind of amusing.
That is amusing.
Yeah.
You gotta like that.
Yeah, you gotta like that.
So there won't be the greatest bond trader ever? The man who solved the bond market's not coming anytime soon?
Do that book, sure. If he does something special, that would be a new challenge. I like the challenge. But I do think there's a new freedom that people have, again, not just on Wall Street, but in society, to be critical of the media, and me included. The flip side is there's a new appreciation, too. There's a
for sure
renewed appreciation of what we do, and I sense that as well. Readership is up, both at the Wall Street Journal, where I am, and elsewhere.
Washington Post, New York Times, all their Atlantic, New Yorker, all their subscriptions are through the roof because they've been covering the new thing, which is the Trump administration calling journalists the enemy of the people.
Exactly. And to some extent, he's right. We are going to miss him. He brings news. He creates news every single day. It's exhausting. It's emotionally draining for us, but it does sell papers, and we are going to miss that.
So we had an interesting conversation about politics in the 2020 election, and a bunch of people were talking about what could lead to Trump losing his reelection campaign. And my position was Trump fatigue. I was praying after the 26th election. All right, now that's over. We can get back to normal. I think it's used the word exhausting. People just want to get back to normal. It's never ending and it's too much.
Yes.
Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it's like, you know what? I'd like to go through a day where the president is not 3 front page stories every day.
Yeah, the question is, do people feel that way in the swing states and in our country?
It's Pennsylvania and Ohio.
It's fascinating.
Basically,
not even Ohio, I don't think. I think Trump's got Ohio.
Florida,
maybe
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania,
Wisconsin and Michigan are going the other way. It's Pennsylvania, Ohio, and
I'm sure maybe a toss-up at this point. Small, but it doesn't mean as much.
But if you look at he won 3 states by 77,000 votes, and that put him over the top.
Right.
So whatever we talk about nationally is irrelevant. How those 3 states going to vote?
It's
fascinating. And that's
fascinating.
Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, plus Michigan and Wisconsin.
The real question to me is, if he loses, what does he do? And what happens?
That's fascinating.
Does he leave?
And what happens with... Well, oh, no. So my wife is in the same camp as you. There's no way on God's green earth he stays if he loses. And P.S., I think the Secret Service would march him out of the White House. Our job is to protect you, but also to uphold the Constitution.
Most people agree with you. I agree.
I don't see that
Wall
as a
Street,
threat.
talk to people in D.C. I was just down in D.C.
I think that's a really far-fetched threat.
Agreed. I'm just throwing it on,
I know people. There are a bunch of people who wonder about
something
that.
Listen, if you're a macro tourist, as I am, and to some extent looking at where the world
politics,
is,
me too.
Right. You got to at least consider all kinds of possibilities nowadays, more than ever.
Right. To say the least. And what are you most optimistic about with journalism?
I just spoke to a group down in the D.C. area, students, and it's easier to have a voice. You can start a podcast. You can start a blog. You can break news locally. You can be on Twitter. Did it. I'm sorry? There you go. Right.
Yeah, you could do any of those things.
Yeah, there are new ways to have a voice that in the past there weren't. You don't have to be in the mainstream media necessarily to have influence and have an impact. So, and you still can have impact and improve things and write about people. And that's one thing I always tell journalists, focus on the people. You can get at important themes through the individuals, and they make for the most memorable stories, at least the way I look at it.
We didn't talk about the John Paulson trade at all, so I'm going to move this back to the earlier part. This will be the last question of the regular discussion, but I want to bring it up here. So you write a book about John Paulson, the greatest trade ever, but I find there's some really interesting oddities about the trade. Not that it's not legit, but whether or not it was really John Paulson who deserves all the credit. Paolo Pellegrini is his research assistant, seems to be the person who comes up with the idea, brings it to Paulson, has to twist his arm a little bit to get him behind it. The trade makes literally $5 billion, $6 billion for the fund. Paulson, and I don't remember if this was your book or your article or somewhere else, it's all a blur. Paulson gives Pellegrini a bonus check for $250 million. Am I remembering that correctly? Or was it more?
It was 175. There's a funny story where
$175 million.
Right.
And Pellegrini's response is $175 million, I quit. Is that fair?
It wasn't right then. It was later on he quit. And
how much later was it?
It was a good 6 months later, and it wasn't necessarily. He was okay with that.
He was?
Yeah, $175 million. How do you be upset about that?
Because it's not even 10% of the $6 billion.
Agreed. But he was fine with that. Listen, Paulson was the one taking the risk. If the trade had blown up, it wouldn't have blown up. But if it hadn't worked out, then Paulson would have had to close down his fund probably.
Right.
So Pellegrini was okay with that. I think the bigger argument is that Paulson, I don't give him so much credit for being short housing. There were a lot of people, if you recall, you probably know.
Right, absolutely.
Nation,
100.
There were a lot of people that were worried about housing. What I do give John Paulson credit for is figuring out a way to express that trade, express that bearishness. And that, to some extent, is Paolo Pellegrini. I agree.
Right.
Pellegrini told John Paulson, hey, boss, there are these things called CDS contracts. Really? What are they? So Paulson had no idea what CDS contracts, and that obviously was the key to the greatest trade ever. Mm-hmm. So I give Pellegrini a lot of credit in the book and otherwise for coming up with a way to express that trade. But I also give John Paulson tremendous credit for he was a 50-year-old guy who didn't know anything about the debt markets, and he threw himself into learning about how to express that trade when lots of other people were sticking with equities and shorting equities.
So the postscript to Paulson is 2 subsequent hedge fund performances. Pellegrini launches his own fund, quickly raises $1 billion as the guy behind the Paulson trade. I think the first year he just shoots the lights out. It's like 88%.
Good memory,
Some crazy number. The second year, they're barely up for 8%, 6%, something like that. The third year, they're negative. They return the money, and he basically retires to some island in the Caribbean. More or less accurate?
More or less, yeah.
So that's astonishing. Paulson, on the other hand, the fund scales up to $46 billion. He becomes a macro tourist in gold and other things. It's a terrible bet. He's a big buyer at the peak. The fund puts up some pretty crappy numbers for a couple of years, and now the fund is back to, what, single-digit billions?
And it's mostly his money, too.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's become a family office, and he proceeded to lose $20 or $30 billion. So someone said, and I haven't verified this, but career-wise, net, he's a money loser for his outside investors.
I think it's close. And I would argue that he missed the lesson of the greatest trade ever. Why do I call it the greatest trade ever? Because it had limited downside and remarkable upside. And frankly, that's what he did his whole career. Even when he was a risk arb, he was getting into positions a little riskier than most other risk arbs, but they had potential for upside. A new buyer comes in a merger deal, and limited downside because I already had a deal. His whole career, he was doing those kind of trades until he did the greatest trade ever. And then he took on all this new money, and he started betting on banks and on pharmaceutical companies and gold, lots of upside, but also lots of downside. He missed the lesson.
The exact opposite of what Simons did with Medallion. Hey, this won't scale, and we want to make sure our upside and downside
That's a great
risk
point.
reward is balanced. The greatest trade led to the man who did not solve the market, and that basically created what is now ostensibly a hedge fund, but really a family office for the Paulson fortune.
Yeah, it's a great point that John Paulson is a very good investor, but he got too big. And how many times have we seen that same story?
Over and over.
And these guys are fallible like anybody else. You can be smart, but take on too much money, and then you're going with your second best idea, your third best idea, etc. And he missed that lesson. Everyone thinks I'm the exception. Oh, because I did the greatest trade ever, and I caught this one before other people, and they're wrong. And it's tough to take on all that AUM. And as you suggest, Jim Simons capped, at least the Medallion Fund, he capped that. So maybe he learned that lesson.
For sure. And our last two questions. What sort of advice would you give a recent college grad who is interested in either becoming a journalist or a book author or covering Wall Street and finance?
Well, this is a broader recommendation for young people in general. Find the people, find the individuals in whatever area you're interested in who are the pace setters, who are the key individuals, people that you respect, and reach out to them. Send them a note. Hey, I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee. You have 20 minutes of your time. People are generous with their time. You'd be surprised. I'm sure you found it too. People on Wall Street, senior people, want to help, want to give back, are much more generous with their time than you might think. Don't be intimidated. If you've got genuine interest, reach out to them. Tell them why you're interested in the area. Form a relationship and learn from them.
And our final question, what is it that you know about the world of writing and journalism today that you wish you knew 25 years or so ago when you were first getting started?
That your relationships are the most important thing you've got, and you've got to develop them. You've got to be kind to people that are kind to you. I always was, but it's been reinforced in me. But also the fact that our reputations are created and recreated almost on a daily basis. So you can be doing poorly at your job. I've had times at the Wall Street Journal where I was low man on the totem pole, and people didn't really give me good assignments. And you can change that. That's the beauty of it. You go break a story. You can change. Your reputation can transform. And if you blow it, your reputation is impacted too. So don't make any mistakes, but don't lose hope. Just tomorrow's a new day. Go break a story.
Quite fascinating. We have been speaking with Gregory Zuckerman, the author of The Man Who Solved the Market, How Jim Simon Launched the Quant Revolution. If you enjoy this conversation, well, be sure and look up an inch or down an inch on Apple iTunes, where you could see any of our previous 258 conversations we've had over the past 5+ years. We love your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Write to us at mibpodcast@bloomberg.net. Go to Apple iTunes and give us a review. I would be remiss if I did not thank the crack staff who helps put together this conversation each week. Carolyn O'Brien is my audio engineer. Atika Valbrun is our project manager. Michael Batnick is my reluctant head of research. Mike Boyle is my producer. I'm Barry Ritholtz. You've been listening to Masters in Business on Bloomberg Radio.